Well, hey there, beloved. How you guys doing? Another good day. A little rainy today, at least, but that's okay. We need rain too sometimes. So I wanted to tell you another bedtime story. You guys ready for bed? You guys, is it a good time? Okay. Well, then we'll go ahead and tell one then. Remember the rules, right? So the rules are, what's the first rule? Heads on pillows, right? And then the second rule, only whisper. I'll talk, you whisper. Okay. So this was just this the next part of the story. It's is Rezzie was at home, and it was one of those mornings where everything seemed busy, just a lot going on everywhere. And it wasn't late in the morning; it was still pretty early in the morning. Rezzie was home with his mom, and he was cleaning his room because she said so, and she was getting Rezzie's little sister dressed for the day, and Stever the Beaver was getting things cleaned up in the yard down the way a little bit, and his dad was out there helping him, and they're working together. And all the animals were running about. There were chipmunks running around and squirrels running around. All sorts of different creatures were just kind of seemed busy, and they were totally interrupted by a crazy sound. See, overhead there were birds flying, and the birds were crying out, "Fire! Fire! Fire!" They were terrified. The birds were telling them that there was a fire in the forest. So Rezzie's mom yelled, "Rezzie, grab some extra clothes and all the food in the house." And so he went and started to gather things together. And Stever and his dad did the same thing. They all went together because they're going to run from the fire, because that's what you do when there's a forest fire. You just get away. And just as they were all gathering their stuff to go, Rezzie and Stever's friend Mike, the guy, the man, he comes running up and he says, "There's a fire! There's a fire! We got to stop it!" And the animals looked at him and thought, "Are you nuts? You can't stop a fire. Once a fire starts, the fire just burns until it wants to stop on its own. We got to run." And Mike said, "No, I think we can stop it." And Mr. Beaver said, "How do you stop a fire?" And Mike said, "Well, fires need fuel to burn. They burn. And in the forest, they burn trees. But we just need to get rid of a bunch of trees so the forest will stop wherever that is." So we got a pretty funny look out of Mr. Beaver. And of course, Rezzie's mom was like, "No, no, no, we got to run." And Rezzie's like, "No, Mom, Mike's really smart, and the guy uses fire to cook fish. So he understands fire. Let's listen to what he has to say before we run." So Mike gathered all the animals, and they got everybody together, and there were hundreds of animals around. And Mike said, "Listen, remember there's that patch of pine trees, and it runs up to that really, really big rock outcropping that comes out of the mountain, and it goes all the way down to the river. And it's just this big area, and it's nothing but pine trees. And the pine trees don't grow as tall in this area as the hardwood trees do." So Mr. Beaver's like, "Well, yeah, he's right." And then he said, "Here's what we're going to do. We're going to cut down all of the pine trees, and we're going to get them out of the way so when the fire gets there, there's nothing to burn." And Mr. Beaver looked, and he said, "Pine trees are a lot easier to cut down than the oak trees and the hickory trees around here. It's a lot softer wood. I think we could do that." He said, "Besides, pine tastes really good, so I'm all in." So some folks laughed. They were all scared. And Mike said, "No, I really think this is going to work. We're just going to have to cut down all the trees and roll them out of the way." So all the animals decided to give it a shot. They figured, well, we'll give it a couple of hours. The fire seemed pretty far off because they didn't see smoke. They just had the birds were just flying and telling them about the fire. So they all set off for this area of the forest that was mostly pine trees that went from the rock outcropping in the mountain all the way down to the river. And they got to work. They started near the mountain, and the beavers just started chomping away and cutting down trees. And then all the animals would do their best to drag the trees and roll them. And it was slow going. It was really hard. You know how heavy a tree is? This is hard work. So they're going at it, and the beavers are going, and Mr. Beaver sent Stever down to get all of his cousins and their aunts and uncles, and there are all the beavers, and they're just chomping away at these pine trees. And every couple of seconds you hear, "Timber!" and a pine tree falls over, and then the young beavers would try to nibble off all the branches, and then all the animals would roll the pine trunk and all the branches, and they would roll it all towards where the fire was coming from. Figured they would just stop it right there. So they were super excited about this. but they were still scared. But they started making headway, but it wasn't going as fast as they wanted to. So they did all their best. They kept going. And after a couple hours, they stopped and said, "Do you think we're going to make it?" And Mr. Beaver said, "Well, it kind of depends on how fast the fire is moving and how far away it is. Because this will take us probably a day and a half or 2 days to clear this area at the rate we're going. But I don't know how long it's going to take the fire to get here." Of course, nobody could answer that question. They couldn't see the fire. They just knew from the birds that it was coming. So they said, "Well, let's just keep going a little bit longer and see what we think." So they kept going a little bit longer and a little bit longer. And every now and then some animals would come running out of the forest. They'd say, "We're running from the fire. We're running from the fire." And then the animals that were working to clear the pine trees out of the way said, "Well, help us. We're going to make a break." They called it a break, where the fire would stop. So the fire would burn right up to the break, but there'd be nothing else to burn. So then one of the animals that was running, it was a big, beautiful buck, a deer with antlers. And he said, "Well, if you take all the trees out, the ground's still covered with pine needles, and they burn fast." And they thought, "That's true. You're right." So then they got all the bucks to use their antlers like rakes on the ground, and a lot of the smaller animals got sticks with a whole bunch of things coming out, and they were raking up all the pine needles, and they were taking the pine needles down and throwing them in the river, and they were cutting down these pine trees. It looked amazing. Hundreds of animals working together, trees falling over and leaves flying all over the place, and chunks of wood flying everywhere, and animals as big as giant buck were moving all this stuff, and animals as little teeny as chipmunks were helping out. It was unbelievable. No one ever saw anything like it in all of the history of the forest. Well, they kept working. Still, Mike was concerned because he thought, fire in a forest can move pretty fast. I hope we get done in time. Well, most of the day had been gone, and they were about halfway there, and they were really tired, but they knew they had to keep going. And then a bunch of bears come running out of the forest. And they came into the clearing that they had, that the animals had created, and they looked around. "What are you guys doing?" And Rezzie went up and said, "We're making a fire break so we can stop the fire and save all of our homes." And one of the bears said, "Well, you're nuts." And just as he said that, a familiar voice, at least to Rezzie and to Mike and Stever, came from behind all of them. It was Bartholomew the bear. And Bartholomew said, "You know, when I was young, the whole forest burned down because we just ran. But it sounds like Mike and all these animals have a great idea to stop it. I think we should try." Well, the bears were very respectful of Bartholomew, who's a much older bear. So they said, "Well, how can we help?" And Mike said, "Can you help move the trees?" Well, do you guys have any idea how strong a bear is? See, it was taking 30 or 40 animals to roll one pine tree over by over where the break was. Well, they'd get a bear on either end of the tree, 2 bears, and they'd pick up the tree and they would throw it. Unbelievable to see these big bears. "Okay, 1, 2, 3, and all flying away would go the tree, and everyone just scattered so they didn't get clobbered by the flying tree. Amazing. So with the bears going full bore, they're really working hard, and the beavers working really hard, they just started flying down toward the river. Unbelievable. And they got every scrap of pine needle and every chip of wood, and they threw it in the river, and it washed downstream. And they were just about done, and they could start to smell smoke of the forest fire, which meant that the fire was getting closer and closer. And as the sun was setting and it was getting dark, you could see the glow of the fire over the trees up in the sky, and you could see the smoke rising into the sky. It was getting close. And they kept going. They kept cleaning up everything, and they even made it a little bit wider. They went back and they went further away, and they took a few more trees down, trying to make more space so the fire couldn't jump over the clearing, because fire, it can do that in the wind, because fire can get in the top of the trees and the wind can blow, and it can just blow ashes into the non-burning trees, and they can catch fire. That'll happen. And Mike knew that, so he said, "We need to make the space as big as we can." And he explained it to some of the older animals, and some of the, like Bartholomew and Mr. Beaver. They understood why they were doing it. Mike explained how forest fires spread. Well, wow, it was really really getting late, and they could see fire through the trees, and they all gathered. And then they realized that if this fire can jump over this break, we're in big trouble. So Mike told everybody, listen, if the fire gets over the break, run to the river and cross the river, because the river was pretty wide. And he said, you bigger animals are going to have to help the smaller animals because they may not be able to swim through the current. So if you're a big animal, just don't go across. Make sure you have some small animals on your back because we get everybody out of here safely. So they had a safety plan backup just in case. And then they gathered and they watched the fire come closer and closer to where they had created the break. And they could feel the warmth of the fire, and it got hotter, and they could hear it roaring through the trees, and it was so scary. Rezzie was holding on to his mom's leg. He didn't even realize how afraid he was. He was holding on to his mom's leg. And Rezzie's mom was holding on to Mike's leg. They were amazed and terrified at the sight of this fire. And the fire got closer, and it got closer. And then before you know it, the trees that they had rolled up and pushed at the one side of the break started to burn. And the trees standing there started to burn, and fire was shooting up into the sky. And they were standing there watching it. And then it looked like the fire was starting to leap over the break. The wind was blowing gently, and every now and then you'd get some sparks flying into the trees. And Mike said, oh, no, this doesn't look good. So Rezzie's mom said, well, should we run now? And then Bartholomew stepped in. Bartholomew said, no, it's not time to run quite yet. And they, well, what do we do? What can we do? So he said, let's gather all the animals together. So they gathered all the animals together, and Bartholomew started to pray. And this is what Bartholomew said. He said, Father in heaven, we know that you have created all of the forest, and you have put all the good things in the forest. You put fish in the stream, and you put blueberries on the hillside. You made all these pine trees that we cut down, and everything in the forest is yours, including us. You made us too. Now, a lot of the animals had never heard a prayer before, so they had no idea what was going on. But they knew something big was happening, so they reverently stood there. Plus, you have to be respectful of an old bear like Bartholomew. And he continued, and he said, Father in heaven, our homes are dependent on you. Our lives are dependent on you. Every single day, not just because of a fire, but every day. But today we have a special need. We have this fire, and it's scaring us. And we know that we can trust in you, but we need you to take care of us. And that was it. Bartholomew stopped. The animals were silent. But the fire was not. It was roaring on the other side of the break. The tongues of fire up into the sky, leaning towards them. Now, the fire's not alive. It's not actually trying to get them. But it's leaning in, and they're just thinking, oh, no, the fire is going to get over the break. What are we going to do? And then it happened. The first couple of drops of rain fell. And then some more. And then some more. And then it started to rain. And then it really started. You know, like that rain where you can hear it on the roof of your house, just really loud, really started to rain. Now the fire kept burning on the other side of the break, but the ashes stopped flying across. And the trees that were going to get hit by the ashes were soaking wet. There's no way they were going to catch fire. And the animals just looked at Bartholomew and said, what did you do? Bartholomew laughed. He said, I didn't do anything. I just asked the guy that made all this stuff to take care of us, and looks like he did. And that's exactly what happened. It rained all night long. And the animals stayed out watching the fire because they were not going to go into their house and take a nap. They stayed up all night watching to make sure they were still safe. But it rained all night long. The fire never made it through the break. And in the morning, the fire had died down on the other side because it ran out of fuel and it was getting wet because it was raining so hard. And by the end of the next day, the fire was completely out. Now, a lot of the animals that ran out of the forest lost their homes because they ran away from the fire. So Rezzie and all of his neighbors said, well, come and move with us. There's plenty of food. It'll be fine. Plus, we know we can work together to make things work. So just come live with us. So that's what happened. A bunch of families of bears moved in. There's a whole bunch of deer that came along. There were more chipmunks than you could count. Now, I like chipmunks. I think they're kind of cute. Lots of chipmunks, a whole bunch of squirrels. There were even a whole bunch of new frog families that come in. Who knew? It was just a whole new neighborhood. But it was way better because they were all working together all the time. Amazing, amazing day in the forest. And I'm so glad that God intervened and sent rain to stop the fire. Aren't you? What would Rezzie do? Where would he live? He might even move so far away that he wouldn't be able to see his friend Mike. So that is the story of when they saved the forest from fire and they all worked together. And the last thing they needed to do to make it work is they prayed. Isn't that awesome? So I'm going to pray for you right now. Heavenly Father, for anyone that's listening to this story, I pray that you would bring rest and peace and that they would know, Lord, that there's no fire that you can't put out. There's nothing bigger than you and that you love us so very, very much. We thank you for that in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. So good night. Have some good rest. Don't worry. You're safe from fire. God's on your side because God loves you. And so do I. Good night.